Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us. Welcome to today's workshop titled Writing a Strong Research Plan, which is the second webinar in the Sound Health Initiative Grant Series. My name is Julene Johnson, and today I'm representing the Sound Health Network, which is an initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with the University of California, San Francisco, and in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health, the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, and Renée Fleming. Today's workshop is the second in our Sound Health Initiative Grant Series in collaboration with the NEA and NIH. Today's presentation will be tailored for the NIH and NEA Music and Health Funding Opportunity announcements, but we will also be covering general principles of grant writing. So welcome to all the others who may be joining us. Tom Cheever and Sunil Iyengar will talk more about these FOAs in just a minute. The recording and slides from the previous What You Need to Know to Apply workshop from last July are on the Sound Health Network website, soundhealth.ucsf.edu. Today's workshop will also be recorded and posted on our website. And we also plan to host a Music and Health Grants mock study section in the future, so stay tuned. The mission of the Sound Health Network is to promote research and public awareness about the impact of music on health and wellness. So please visit our website for more information and get involved by signing up for a newsletter and engaging with us on social media. The learning objectives of today's workshop are listed here. We hope that you become familiar with components of a research plan for an NIH grant, understand the basic structure of a specific aims page, learn about the importance of significance, innovation, and conceptual models, and acquire in-depth knowledge about the research design, methods, and data analysis plan sections of a grant. Here's the outline of today's workshop. We will spend 90 minutes covering the following topics, and then leave 30 minutes for Q&A. And folks from the NIH, NEA, and Sound Health Network will be available to answer your questions. Just a couple of notes before we get started. Closed captioning is available. If you have questions for the panelists, please type them into the YouTube chat. We will answer as many questions as possible after the presentation. Okay, let's get started with introductions for the lineup for today. I want to first introduce my colleagues, Drs. Sheri, Robb, and Neilands, who will be co-presenting with me. Both Sheri and Tor will say a little bit more about themselves later. But in short, Dr. Robb is a professor at Indiana University and is on the leadership team of the Sound Health Network. Dr. Neilands is a UCSF professor, and we are colleagues at the UCSF Center for Aging in Diverse Communities. And Tor is the lead for the analysis core. They were both tapped for their talent in teaching grant writing. Next, I'll introduce Sunil Iyengar, who is the director of the NEA's Office of Research and Analysis. As I mentioned, the Sound Health Network is an initiative of the NEA. Dr. Tom Cheever is a program director for the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the NIH. Tom has been a strong advocate for the music and health research. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Cheever to introduce the other NIH staff who've joined us today. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Julene. And I think I'll just wanted to thank my NIH colleagues who were listed on the previous slide for their contributions and participation here, and just grateful to the Sound Health Network for including us. We'll be available to answer questions during the Q&A and at any other point during the discussion as well. And also just kind of want to direct people to the previous grant writing workshop that we had given that Julene had mentioned, which includes kind of a lot more information about some of the kind of NIH basics of how to find funding opportunities and that kind of thing. But so I think I will leave it at that and pass it back over to you, Julene. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cheever. Now I'd like to turn it back over to both you and Sunil to tell us a little bit more of the NIH and NEA Music and Health funding opportunity announcements.
Thanks, Julene. I can go since I have the camera on here. Just real briefly, would encourage anyone, I think the easiest way to find out about funding opportunities at NIH is actually just Google NIH and Sound Health, and that will take you to the NIH homepage where we have a lot of information about current funding opportunities, current events happening, past events, a lot of resources, how to find the parts of the NIH that are involved in this collaborative effort. And I think that's the easiest way to kind of find what those current funding opportunities are. There are currently 3 of them live right now and will be at least for the next year. So encourage anyone that's interested to check those out and reach out to the scientific contacts listed at the bottom of those funding opportunities if you have any kind of further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Sunil, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Julene. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, especially side by side with my NIH colleagues. Really, since 2019, the NEA has been a proud co-sponsor of the NIH's music and health funding opportunities that Tom just mentioned, and we really value that partnership. We also want to grow the number of competitive applications for that pool. So hence this meeting, this webinar opportunity today. Also, you may not know, but we offer our own research award opportunities at the NEA. We support grants and what are called research labs, which are multi-year research programs to look at various aspects of the arts and various other domains, the value and impact of the arts, that is. And we have quite a few in number that are in the music and health space. So I'd urge you to go look at our research grant opportunities. If you go to arts.gov and go to grants awards, you'll find more information about that program. But also the music and health grants that we currently support, a lot of them are showcased at the Sound Health Network website. So the Sound Health Network, as was explained, is a partnership with University of California, San Francisco. And we're really proud of being able to stand up this National Resource Center for opportunities such as this one, to really build capacity for the researchers in this space, as well as practitioners at this intersection of music, neuroscience, and health, and music therapy. So we strongly, we're really supportive of this particular effort and all the others that will come after, we hope, to try to cultivate more rigorous research and to fill needed gaps in research and training for the next generation of researchers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil. Okay, let's get started. I'll kick us off by providing an overview of the research plan section of an NIH grant, and then talk about the specific aims page. Teaching grant writing is near and dear to my heart. I teach grant writing to PhD students here in the UCSF School of Nursing, and I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training, but I also did my undergraduate in music, in flute performance and music therapy. But then I got my PhD in cognitive neuroscience so I could do music research. And my lab at UCSF studies music and aging. And today we'll focus on the research plan section of an NIH grant. While not everyone would agree that the specific aims page is part of a research plan, I include it for several reasons. Along with the conceptual model, which will be covered later, I typically write the specific aims page first. It requires the most revisions. And in fact, I often will do up to 20 versions of my specific aims page per grant. So it takes a lot of effort. And the specific aims page can also be used to facilitate a discussion with your program officer before submitting your grant. And finally, if you identify the public health problem and gaps in the literature and work out the logical arguments in your specific aims page, you can usually write your research strategy section more efficiently. And there's also other parts to an NIH grant, but we won't be covering them today. But importantly, please keep in mind that there's not one way to write a grant. And today we're sharing our collective wisdom from writing grants over several decades. There are different approaches for different grant mechanisms and different disciplines. There's also different styles for quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research design. So please keep that in mind today. Okay, let's start with the specific aims page. Again, it's technically not part of the research plan, but it's a very important section that is related to your research plan. So the specific aims page is considered the most important page of your grant application, and it's only one page. It should summarize the importance of the public health problem and the gaps that your proposal plans to address. It should also provide strong, compelling, and logical arguments for your research proposal. And it should be easy to read and understand. As I mentioned, the specific aims page can also be used to facilitate a discussion with your NIH program officer before submitting your grant. So to help demystify the specific aims page, I like to think about it as a series of building blocks. And not all specific aims pages are written like this, but I find this structure to be a useful tool for organizing your thoughts. So let's start with a typical paragraph 1. The purpose of paragraph 1 is to provide a strong argument about the importance of the public health problem that your grant proposal will address. A few strategies that can be used to highlight the importance of the public health problem, if appropriate, are, for example, to write about how it may affect a lot of people. For example, Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia, and about 6.5 million people in the United States live with Alzheimer's disease. Or perhaps you could also argue that it costs a lot of money. And as another example, it typically costs an additional $400,000 to care for somebody living with dementia. You might want to bring that out in your paragraph 1. But you might also highlight that a certain public health problem may have additional negative impact on a variety of health outcomes. Perhaps a condition is associated with reduced quality of life, or it also may increase risk of death. And finally, another way to highlight the importance of the problem is to say that other organizations say the problem is important. Now let's look at paragraphs 2 and 3. The purpose of paragraph 2 is to provide a convincing argument that your study is needed. And you can do this by synthesizing and critiquing existing literature in about 4 to 5 sentences, and also identify the specific gap that your proposal will fill. And be sure to state the facts and not make broad generalizations in this paragraph. You want to get your reviewer excited and your audience excited about what you're wanting to study. Now to paragraph 3, this is a paragraph whose purpose is to provide a convincing argument that your grant will address this gap that you just talked about in paragraph 2, provide a solution, and that you and your research team should do the research. And you can do this by noting the overall goal of your proposal, the overall hypothesis, an overall approach. So in other words, you give an overall sense of the proposal. You can also provide a brief statement about your team's expertise, and some people like to add preliminary data here, if appropriate. And I want to remind you that these are just my suggestions based on my experience of grant writing. So there's different ways that you can structure your specific aims page. The next section of the aims page is typically the specific aims statements. And this is the text you wrote. The text you wrote in the preceding paragraph should build up to the aim statements and flow naturally after the phrase. Therefore, the specific aims of the study are to ... And then you can then begin with a verb stem that is appropriate for your study. For example, to examine X or to assess Y. Each aim should provide the reviewer with an idea of the approach that you will take to analyze your data. And hypotheses and rationale can sometimes be included here too. Ideally, though, the aims should be related but not dependent upon each other, so that the failure of one aim or an unexpected result from one of the aims should not negatively influence any other aim or prevent you from completing the aims that you've proposed in your grant. So the last paragraph of the specific aims page is typically the impact section. It's typically 2 to 3 sentences, and it outlines the expected outcome and describes specific ways in which your proposed project will be of value to the funding agency, field of inquiry, and society. It might also address innovation and suggest the next study that builds on the proposed study. So to summarize, paragraph 1 highlights the importance of the public health problem. Paragraph 2 You do a synthesis of the literature and identify the gap in the literature that your grant will fill. Paragraph 3 highlights why you and your team should do the study. The aim statements come next, and then followed by the impact text, which is the expected outcome or the effect on the science or the field. But I'll close here with just a few thoughts on the style of a specific aims page, because it is one of the most difficult pages in a grant to write. The specific aims page of the grant should include strong logical arguments, and they should also provide specific information. For example, you want to say something like 50 million Americans report chronic pain rather than chronic pain is a problem. And I highly recommend using short, discrete, and easy to read sentences, as every word matters, and make sure that the sentences are what I call clear and crisp or punchy. And avoid situations where your reviewer might trip up on a word or a sentence. And by this, I mean avoiding long sentences, especially dependent clauses. Be careful when you use those, because that's typically where you might lose the reader. Use consistent terminology and abbreviations throughout your grant, and define any of the conditions or terms if needed. And keep in mind that not all the reviewers will be experts in your area. So this is why you want to do this. And remember to start early. Use your specific aims page to start a conversation with your program officer. So those are some of the things I've learned along the way. So thank you for your attention for this first part of the presentation. And next, we will dig into the research strategy section. And Dr. Sheri Robb will talk first about significance and innovation sections. And Dr. Neilands will follow with an in-depth presentation about the approach section.
Thanks, Julene, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here with you today. As Julene mentioned, I'm on faculty at the Indiana University School of Nursing. I direct our Indiana CTSI KL2 program, which is an early career investigator program in translational science. And I also co-direct our T32 training grant for pre and postdoctoral nurse scholars in symptom science. We'll also be referencing some material today from one of my funded NIH grant applications, which was funded through the Sound Health, Music and Health funding opportunity announcements that we're highlighting today. So we'll go ahead and get started on significance and innovation portions of the grant application. And this is where where reviewers will be looking for the information that they need to evaluate core review criteria for both significance and innovation. And you can stay on this slide, Julene. So we're going to start first with the significance section. And so the purpose of this section is to first establish the problem or the critical barrier to progress in your field that this your proposed study is going to address. This also includes establishing the specific gap in knowledge that your work is going to also address and meet a critical need. The second area is to look at and establish the rigor of prior research. This can be your own research, but also of others in the field. And the focus will be on looking at establishing the rigor of that research as it relates to your specific aims. And then finally, we want to tell reviewers the expected contribution of our proposed work to the field overall. So you can go on to the next one. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to highlight was that significance is scored review criteria. Every funding opportunity announcement includes the scored review criteria in that funding announcement. And as reviewers will be looking at that funding announcement for instructions on what to look for in your application. But as someone who's submitting a grant application, you want to pay careful attention to how your grant will be reviewed and scored, making sure that you're using language from that funding opportunity announcement in your entries, because that makes it a lot easier for the reviewer to find the information that they need. Some of the advice I got once that was particularly good is essentially you want to be writing the review for the reader. So write statements in your grant that answer these questions directly. For example, you might have in your application, this project will address the important problem of, and you can fill in the blank, or this project improves scientific knowledge or clinic practice by, and you would fill in the blank. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that some of the funding opportunity announcements, what you see on the screen are common across applications, but sometimes there's specific review criteria that's specified in the funding announcement that you'll want to highlight in your application as well. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, as Julene mentioned before, this is going to look a little bit redundant of what she talked about on the aims page. Here in the significance section, you have usually it's about 4 to 5 pages long, and it's your opportunity to provide more detail on the things that you introduced in the aims page. And really the goal is to tell a story. Many people will use headers to divide the significance section into major categories. Different people approach this in different ways. Robertson, Russell, and Morrison, who offer an NIH grant writing seminar and workshop series, they recommend 3 sections. The first section usually is to establish the importance of the problem. And then the second section generally discusses the rigor of research that supports your aims. And then the third section is an entry that discusses the significance of the expected research contribution. So what I'd like to do next is to drill down a little bit and look at some examples of how it might look, to provide some examples. Okay, so on this slide, these are headers that were taken from our team's funded R01 Music and Health Grant application. And as you can see, we used 4 subsections to organize and arrange our significance section. And I highlighted some of the text that you see in the headers for these sections to kind of show how we used language from the funding opportunity announcement and the scoring criteria to help reviewers find the information that they need. It also provides an impact statement for these areas and lets the reader know what they can expect with further detail in each section. So on the next slide, we're going to drill down a little bit further and provide a little bit more information about how you might organize that content. Okay, so in this slide, you can see that our section 8.1 and 8.3 were really focused on establishing the problem or critical barrier to research in the field that our team wanted to address through this proposed trial. As Julene mentioned, a lot of times you want to include statistics on the numbers of people that were affected, the outcomes, the costs, really establishing the urgency of the problem and how it's impacting people. So you can see, I didn't provide the full text, but you can see that there are some bullets where within each section, you're going to offer a review of literature. You're going to establish what we know and what we don't know. We want to establish, why is this a barrier and why is it important that we address it? And how is our proposed study going to address that gap that you've just established through your entry? Okay, we can go to the next one. Another part of the significance section is to discuss the scientific rigor. So an important part of addressing rigor is establishing that your proposed trial is grounded in rigorous science, so that you're building on a solid scientific foundation. In some cases where the scientific evidence may be lacking, then your argument may be to address that lack of rigor that currently exists. And that should be directly related to your aims. What you don't want to propose is a study that's based on science that is really lacking in terms of its rigor. So you want to address limitations and provide a rationale for your selected methods. So in our grant, as you can see, we anticipated that reviewers would have questions about why we selected our particular biomarker of stress, especially given that we're doing this during cancer treatment. And so oftentimes you want to anticipate the questions that your reviewers are going to have, and then fully address those criticisms that you expect you're going to get, and provide the rationale for why you selected your particular approach and why it is the best approach to address the questions that you've identified. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Here I've provided for you a screenshot of a particular document and the web link that's provided by the NIH that talks about discussing rigor and reproducibility in your grant submission. And the NIH specifies 4 focus areas that you want to address in your application. And this is a really great resource. You can see the link there. I printed it out and I used it as I was writing my grant to make sure that I was addressing all the points that are specified in the guidance document. And the really great thing is that this particular document also lets you know in the far right-hand side where that information should be located in your grant. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, which kind of focuses in on information from this particular resource that's specific, as you can see in the right-hand column, that we should be including this in our significance section, but we might also include this information in the approach. So notice that you can include, in the significance section, you can focus on discussing prior research that supports your specific aims, but in the approach section, you might discuss literature that supports your selected methods. Next slide. Excuse me. So the last subsection of the significance entry is going to specify how and why findings from your specific trial will have an impact. So this is generally done in a 1-paragraph statement. Here I provided some examples from our grant. And notice that we labeled our entry as potential impact. You could also label it as significance of the expected contribution, which would be using that language from the review score criteria to bring attention to it. You can notice from the example that we start with an overall impact statement that identifies that we're going to advance work in the field in 3 important ways. And then our entry proceeds to list out specifically what are those 3 ways. And then the concluding statement of overall contribution oftentimes is highlighting how the evidence that you find is going to advance the field in a very specific way, and how those findings can be potentially used to address an even larger problem in the future. Okay, next slide. So the next section that I wanted to highlight is the innovation section. And some investigators really struggle with differentiating significance from innovation. And what you want to avoid is repeating information that you included in your significance section into innovation. So something that kind of helps you to think about how these are different. In the significance section, we're really centering on the problem or the critical barrier that your study is going to address. In innovation section, we really want to center on the solutions that you bring that actually represent a new approach to solving that particular problem. Okay, so like significance, innovation is a scored review criteria. So just like the significance section, I would encourage you to look at the review criteria that's listed in the funding opportunity announcement, and also for specific review criteria that might be unique to your particular funding announcement. Again, this is really important because it helps you to know what content you need to have included in this section, because this is exactly what the reviewer will be responding to in their critique. Okay, and this is an innovation section example, not the full entry, but again, our team elected to use headers to highlight the innovations of our particular grant application. Often the innovation entry is about a paragraph in length, but it can be longer. Another approach that's different from the one that we used, also recommended by Robertson and colleagues, is to divide that section into 3 parts. And I like this particular recommendation because sometimes it's important to establish what is the status quo for research in the field that you are studying in. Sometimes you'll have reviewers who come from different fields. So something that's considered a departure from the status quo or innovative for one field is not necessarily considered a departure from the status quo or innovative in another field. So you really want to set your reviewer up for understanding what's currently known or done in the field, and how is what you're doing introducing something new and innovative that's going to help advance science in the field. Okay, and then the last piece that I'm going to address is talking about the use of conceptual frameworks in your grant submission. A lot of times these are located in the significance section, but sometimes they're included in the approach. So really it depends on where you feel that it fits in the best as you're discussing your application. So the thing about conceptual frameworks, the reason why they're so important and can be helpful to your grant submission is they provide this visual depiction of your proposed study and specific aims as well as hypotheses. Oftentimes they tie together both theory and scientific evidence that is informing your study aims and your variables of interest. And I really recommend that you include both a figure and then a narrative that really takes the reviewer through your figure and helps pull your whole proposal together. So here, I provided a copy of the conceptual framework that accompanied our grant application. What I'll highlight is that the figure does help to illustrate our aims and our hypotheses. They're numbered. It highlights and illustrates the expected interaction of our proposed mediators and outcomes of interest. You might notice that underneath each domain or outcome that we're looking at, we specify the measures that we're using. And then our narrative basically tells the story from left to right about why we chose these particular covariates, what's in the literature to suggest that they're important to take into account and measure, and then takes you through to the relationship of why we expect the intervention to impact salivary cortisol and our outcomes of interest on the right-hand side. And now I'm going to, we'll go to the next slide. And Julene, would you like to talk about this other example of a theoretical framework that people could use?
Thank you, Sheri. Yes, this is the conceptual model that I used in one of our recent grants, where we have an R61, R33 as part of the music and health funding opportunities. And what we are doing is developing and testing a piano improvisation training program and testing the hypothesis that through the putative mechanism of change of self-regulation, that we're able to increase cognitive engagement and well-being among older adults with and without mild cognitive impairment. And this, as I mentioned, is part of the science of behavior change concept. And there's a whole website related to outcomes and constructs related to science of behavior change. But then you can see that as part of our grant, we're going to be using these top, what we call assays, to try to better understand if self-regulation is part of one of the mechanisms that can improve cognitive engagement. And we'll do that with some functional MRI, working with Dr. Charles Lim. We'll also have some performance-based measures and some self-report measures related to self-regulation. We're also interested in well-being. So this is one of the other constructs that we know that there's a relationship between engaging in music among older adults and doing music training. So we also want to see if we can see a change in that over time. So this is just another example of a different type of conceptual model. It looks a little different than Sheri's, but it kind of has that same idea where you can look at the hypotheses that are being tested. You know what the intervention, and you also can understand what the outcomes of interest are. So I'll turn it back over to Sheri.
Well, I think that's the end of my slides.
Okay, I'll come back on. So just to recap, that we went over the specific aim section. Sheri went over the significance and innovation sections. And then now we have Dr. Neilands, who is going to go over the approach section. But if I remember correctly, I think this might be the place that we take a short 5-minute break. So we will be back here at, how about at 10:45? We'll give you a couple more minutes since we're running ahead of schedule, which is terrific. Okay, sign off until 10:45 or 1:45 on the East Coast. Thanks, everybody. Okay, welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. We're really excited to hear some questions from our listeners after Dr. Neilands does his presentation, and we hope to hear from you too soon. And then at this point, I'll turn it over to Tor. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Julene. As was mentioned at the top of the presentation, I'm Tor Neilands. I'm a professor at UCSF, affiliated with the Analysis Core for the Center for Aging in Diverse Communities. I also do a lot of HIV-related research at the Center for AIDS Prevention Studies at UCSF, and probably of most relevance to this group today, co-direct a summer training program for early career scholars who are doing social and behavioral science research in U.S. minority communities that are most disproportionately impacted by the HIV epidemic. And the centerpiece of that program is a 6-week summer intensive grant writing boot camp. I also do a lot of quantitative method support for grant applicants who are at CAPS at UCSF, and I've been on about 80 different federal and non-federal grants over the course of my 20-year career doing this. So by working with many excellent colleagues, I've learned through osmosis, I guess, some hopefully helpful tips that I'll try to remember to relate as we work through the approach and data analysis plan sections. And I've one of the primary things I do on the pre-award side with my colleagues is write data analysis and sample size plans for the quantitative portions of their NIH grant proposals. So as you'll see when we get to those slides, there'll be a bit of an emphasis on that aspect of the approach. So with that introduction, Julene, could you please, thank you. You anticipated it before I even asked for it. Wonderful. So the approach section is often the section that scores the poorest and receives the most reviewer comments in NIH reviews. And I think this is because it's often the longest section of the application, and it also encapsulates really what you are going to do with your research and studies. So while there may be somewhat less controversy about what's been done before in the literature that's covered in the significance section, the approach section is a place where I think reviewers can really latch on to specific details about what you're proposing to do. And if they have very strong opinions about that, that can sometimes come through in the reviews. And because there is detail there, it gives reviewers an entry point to critique what's being proposed. So the overall goal of my presentation here is to invite you to consider how you can make your approach section as rigorous as possible. And we're going to do that by describing the approach section of an NIH grant application and its core components. We'll offer some recommendations for developing a strong and rigorous approach section. And then we'll also describe some cautions offered by the NIH on what can cause approach sections to be scored poorly. And I'm really excited that we have so many of our NIH colleagues on the Zoom with us today, both from the program side and the review side, because I'm sure collectively they have a tremendous amount of experience and wisdom to contribute to this conversation as well. Julene, next slide, please. So in my experience, often the investigators will start an approach section with a description of the study team. It's not strictly required, and I've seen some applicants eschew it or give maybe just a 1 or 2 sentence, very kind of 30,000-foot overview of the team, and then point reviewers to the bio sketches and budget justification to learn more. But I think this is also an opportunity if you have the room, have the space to describe the principal investigator a little bit. And we often see that applicants will use maybe 2 to 4 sentences to describe the PI's expertise and previous experience that will qualify them to conduct the study that's being proposed in the application. Then ideally, each co-investigator and consultant would have about 1 to 2 sentences listing their expertise and what they're going to contribute to the study. So is it qualitative, research methods expertise? Is it intervention, implementation expertise? Is it some content area expertise? These are the kinds of things that can really help the reviewers understand, well, why did the applicant pick this person? And how does that person's expertise as a co-investigator complement that of the PI and the other co-investigators who are on the project? And then often applicants will conclude that paragraph with a sentence referring reviewers to the investigator's bio sketches for more about their qualifications, and then also to the personnel section of the budget justification to learn more about their anticipated contributions to this proposed study. Including this type of paragraph is, as you might imagine, more difficult in a 6-page application like an R21 than in a 12-page application like an R01, just because you have less room. But on the other hand, mechanisms with fewer pages often support smaller teams, so that can increase the feasibility of including a very short paragraph describing the research team. Next, please. So then the next question is, do you include some materials about preliminary studies? And what's stated, I think, often is that some NIH grant applications are really expected to report on preliminary studies, such as an R01 level application. There's a presumption usually that their previous work has been done leading up to this type of large multi-year grant application, but others may not require it. Grants that are more exploratory in nature are considered higher risk applications, such as the R21 mechanism. But it's really important to talk to NIH program staff when you're thinking about submitting a grant application. I mean, that's just good advice in general, but I think one question to ask a program officer when you speak with them about a potential grant application is, can you tell me a little bit about the norms in review around the study section where this application would likely be going in terms of how much preliminary data are expected, even in R21s or R61, R33 type more exploratory applications? Because in my experience, some study sections will really want to see that, where others may not. And then, of course, as Julene and Sheri were mentioning, it's always a good idea to check out the funding announcement and look there to see if there are specific call outs to what sort of preliminary studies information is needed in an application that's responding to a particular RFA or PA. Next slide, please. So if you decide to include preliminary studies, then what should go in this particular subsection of the approach? So one thing to include is summaries of your published and unpublished, i.e. pre-publication findings that support the scientific premise of your study. Another thing to include is descriptions of your ability to feasibly and acceptably, and that's to the study population, recruit research participants and collect primary data. That is, if you are proposing to collect primary data. If you're proposing to collect secondary data, then other considerations might be in play, such as your ability to access the data and having the skill set and experience and team necessary to be able to work with complex sources of secondary data. And then, an example here is that I see very frequently done when investigators are proposing longitudinal research is reporting on strong retention rates from prior longitudinal work that's been conducted by you or your colleagues who are members of the study team. And I think it's wise to lead with your work, but don't forget to include relevant work that's been produced by your collaborating team members, even if you weren't directly involved with it. Because if it's something that a team member has done that would have bearing on the application, then it can help strengthen the application to mention that your team members have that kind of expertise and experience. One thing that I like to recommend is that applicants include a penultimate sentence summarizing for each preliminary finding or paragraph in this subsection, sort of encapsulating what is the take-home message from that preliminary finding, like why is it important, basically. And then also include a final gap sentence per paragraph to point out to the need for current study. So you could say, in my previous work, we found X, Y, and Z, and this is important for these reasons, but there's still this gap remaining that will be addressed by the proposed study. That helps anchor reviewers and remind them that a lot of preliminary work has been done before, but there are still these gaps remaining, and it gives you a bit of a transition also into the lower sections of the approach where you're going to be discussing the new study that you're proposing for this application. Next slide, please. All right, let's discuss research design and methods a little bit. So once you've elucidated the gaps needing study via conceptual framework diagram that Sheri described so beautifully, and also Julene with her example, you're now ready to articulate the research design and methods. Popular strategy is to lay these out aim by aim in sequential order. So you would list the aim 1 approach, then you would have the aim 2 approach, and then you would have the aim 3 approach, for instance. And then within each of these aim blocks, you would describe the study design. So is it a randomized controlled trial? Is it a cluster randomized controlled trial, observational cohort, mixed method, qual dominant, quant subordinate type of design? And one thing I think that's important here is if you are proposing to do a randomized trial, it's a good idea to justify the choice of control group. So is it usual care, waitlist control? Is it time and attention matched control? And why you've chosen the design that you've chosen. Because what you may find is that on study sections, maybe half the reviewers are usual care advocates and half of them are time and attention matched control advocates, and you may not please everybody by choosing a specific design, but if you can defend that choice and show the reviewers that you've really thought carefully about the pros and cons of the different design options, and you've been thoughtful about why you've landed on the particular choice that you've chosen, that can really bolster the perceived rigor of the design and of the study overall. You're going to want to talk a little bit about the data collection setting for studies that are proposing to collect primary data. So, if you are going to collect data in the southeastern United States because particular health conditions are particularly prevalent there, and you're working with a community partner there, for instance, you would want to describe that setting a little bit so the reviewers can understand why you are going to be collecting data from that setting and whether you have potentially community partners on the ground who can collaborate with you to ensure a smooth and successful data collection process. You're going to want to talk about the population that you're planning to study, and you'd want to tie that to the significance. So if you're planning, for instance, to work with a particular health disparity population whom you've described in the significance section, then here you'll want to tie back to that and remind reviewers this is your population and how you're going to sample them and basically recruit them into your study. Then you're going to want to talk about the measurement instruments that you'll be using. And if you're planning to collect survey-based measures where you may have an hour and a half long survey where people are taking multiple measurement instruments. Maybe you're going to measure multiple mental health states such as depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms and things like that. It can be really infeasible to describe each of those measures in a separate paragraph in the application. So what I've seen applicants do very successfully is to put them in a table, and the table can have sub-tables within the main table, and the sub-tables might list exposures, mediators, and outcomes, for instance. And then within that table, you would name the measure. For each row, you would name a particular measure. You would give a citation to where it's been published, validated, and often it's number of items, time to complete the instrument on average, and perhaps an alpha coefficient for reliability if that's relevant for a particular measure. And then applicants will generally present some kind of data analysis plan and sample size justification, and we'll say more about that in a minute or two. And then a summary of what will be learned from the AIMS activities, and if applicable, how those will inform the next AIM. But as Julene and Sheri were cautioning us earlier, you want to be sure to do that without conveying that one aim will be dependent on the results that you get from a previous aim, because if you don't get those results, then that could threaten your ability to carry out that subsequent aim. Next slide, please. All right, as promised, the data analysis and sample size plan. So the data analysis and sample size plan outlines and orders the presentation of considerations that will vary by grant mechanism and scientific content. So here's one example that one of my mentors taught me many, many years ago. And it's usually the organizational structure I start out with when I'm contemplating drafting a data analysis plan. I like to start with saying what sort of descriptive statistics will be generated, and missing data, how will that be considered as part of an overall data assessment step, an initial data assessment step, essentially. And then once we have moved from data assessment and descriptive statistics, we then move to a paragraph that discusses primary inferential analyses, including a restatement, if they've been stated earlier, of the hypotheses. And then underneath that, a description of the models, the statistical models and estimation approaches used to test primary hypotheses. So if I have an hypothesis that listening to classical music is going to lead to a lower odds of reporting dementia-related symptoms, that sounds like a logistic regression. And so I might have that hypothesis that I just articulated, and then underneath, I would say we're going to use logistic regression to test this hypothesis, and here are a few modeling considerations that we'll use when we use the logistic modeling. What techniques will we use if we encounter zero cell issues? How will we look for potentially outlying values, et cetera. And then after that paragraph, we'll move to a secondary exploratory inferential analysis paragraph. So maybe there are some things you want to look at that are maybe the study's not necessarily powered to examine as primary, but you might, for instance, want to see, do men and women differ in their odds of the effects of classical music on reporting of dementia-related symptoms? And maybe that's an exploratory analysis, and you want to look at an interaction and extend the model that you talked about in the primary analysis part to the secondary analysis, and you can do that in that paragraph. And then I like to end with a sample size justification paragraph, which is also known as a power analysis paragraph. And as part of that, if I have room and if it's applicable and seems like a rigorous and useful thing to do, supporting tables of power or minimum detectable effects. And some applicants I've seen put the sample size up more in the participants and recruitment section of the approach, and I think that's fine to do it that way. I personally like to have it come after the proposed analyses, because then it helps me basically be able to say, well, up above we were proposing logistic regression, so we are going to power for a logistic regression that's proposed to test our primary hypotheses. So it's all very logical for the reader. They already know that we were going to be proposing logistic regression. So it enables that power analysis paragraph to be very tight, and hopefully there will be no mystery in it. Whereas my experience reading applications, when you have the power analysis up at the top, before the data analysis description, then it's like the power analysis to me feels very abstract and disconnected from the analysis plan, and I have to scroll forward to see what the analysis plan is, and then circle back to the power analysis up above to see if it matches what's in the analysis plan. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is that for NIH-defined clinical trials, it's really important not to forget to supply a more detailed version of the analysis and sample size justification that will appear in the human subjects section, which I believe is currently Forms G. You may include a more abbreviated version in the research strategy with cross-referencing to Forms G. So when I've reviewed applications, I've seen a gamut of how people choose to report data analysis plans in their applications when they're proposing a clinical trial. I've seen at one end of the continuum, I've seen some applicants who basically put in a sentence in the approach that says, our data analysis plan is described in Forms G, go there and look at it, essentially, all the way to applicants duplicating the same plan in the research strategy and the Forms G. So my suggestion would be to do neither of those extremes, but to do something in the middle, which is to have a fully specified, extensive analysis and sample size plan in the Forms G, but have a reduced form in the research strategy. And the reason why I recommend this is that if you just point a reader to Forms G with no other contextual information, it interrupts the reader's flow. In terms of understanding what is going to be proposed and done. And if you propose, on the other hand, you list the same information in the research strategy that's in Forms G, you don't want to do that, because my understanding, and I see Tom's put up his hand to come on the line, and I have a guess as to what you might be saying here, but I think what Tom may say is that actually NIH policy indicates that people should not duplicate the Forms G write-up in the research strategy. Tom, would you like to come on the line and comment?
Hey, Tor, thanks so much for this. And just so one quick clarification about the Forms G element of this. So NIH, the whole package of forms is actually what's called Forms G. It started at Form A, that kind of thing. And so that includes the section that I think you're referring to is technically called the human subjects clinical trial section. There's also a bunch of other sections too, but just to kind of help people keep track of that. And then just regarding your point, Tor, I think you're dead on about kind of finding a happy medium between those extremes that you found. Just one other thing that I would add to you is to keep in mind this from the perspective of the reviewer, which I think Tor and others here have likely been, and that's that, these application packages get to be hundreds of pages long in some cases. So you want to make sure that reviewers can find that most critical information as easily as possible. So like Tor mentioned, it can be helpful to have some of those really pertinent details. So things that are directly called out in review criteria, such as discussion of blinding randomization, statistical analysis plans, sample size calculations, and power. If by including that, at least snippets of it in that research strategy, you increase your chances that reviewers will find that and be able to say, found it and no issues. And the worst case scenario is if they don't find it at all, say it's not there when you actually did have it, but it was maybe buried somewhere. And like Tor mentioned, there is a separate section in that human subjects clinical trial section that allows you to expand even further on some of this data analysis and sample size calculations. So just to kind of just re-emphasize that these applications get large, reviewers are asked to review many of them at the same time. They do the best that they can, but as an applicant, you can help them by including some of this critical information, sometimes in different language, different framing, or different levels of detail in one section, and maybe re-emphasizing and expanding on another if you're allowed to do that based on the application instruction. So just wanted to add that in there. Hope that was helpful and it didn't confuse anything. Thank you.
Yeah, no, extremely helpful, Tom. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I really like your point that reviewers are being tasked with reading a large number of applications, and the applications, each application has many parts. And so to the extent that you can help the reviewer, as Tom was suggesting, it's going to help your case a lot. And, to that end, some of these sections like the PHS section, they may not necessarily have page limits, but just keep in mind, while you want to be thorough and expand on data analysis and other considerations, try to do so in the minimum amount that you need to make a rigorous case for what it is you're doing, but no more, because the reviewers are tasked with reading hundreds and hundreds of pages from multiple applications. All right, Julene, can we move to the next slide, please? All right, now I'd like to talk a little bit about sex as a biological variable, and it's interesting. Tom mentioned that it is possible for reviewers to lose track of something you feel you have covered, but they may not have picked up on, and that actually happened to me with sex as a biological variable one time. I put it in a secondary analysis paragraph, and a reviewer just plain missed it. So now I have a separate header for sex as a biological variable for all applications I'm working on moving forward. And the history behind this requirement is that women have been historically underrepresented in federally funded research. And so to address this disparity, NIH stepped up and drafted a policy in 2016 regarding sex as a biological variable. And I can't say it any better than NIH has said it. So I have a quote here from the NIH website that talks about NIH expecting that sex as a biological variable will be factored into research designs, analyses, and reporting in vertebrate animal and human studies. Strong justification from the scientific literature, preliminary data, or other relevant considerations must be provided for applications proposing to study only one sex. So the default is that you will be recruiting participants from both sexes, not just one. Investigators are strongly encouraged to discuss these issues with NIH program staff prior to submission of applications. And so what are the implications of this? Well, one is that you want to include justification for distribution of the biological sex of participants in your sampling subsection of the approach. And the other implication, I think, is that you want to include language in the data analysis plan describing analyses that take biological sex into account. So examples of those would be sex stratified analyses and or interaction terms involving biological sex. And there's a nice write-up here at the NIH website that discusses this further, but I think I'd also like to pause and invite our NIH colleagues to come on a line and offer any insights or additional thoughts they'd like to.
Thanks so much, Tori. I would also encourage any of my other NIH colleagues to please feel free to turn on your video and raise your hand to add anything here. So just kind of try to keep this short and sweet. Sex as a biological variable fits into this broader area of consideration of biological variables in research. So sex being one, but age, environmental circumstances, all of those can be factors. And so one way to think about this as you're writing your application are, what are those biological variables that are likely to be relevant to the research that we're looking at here? And sex is going to be one of the most common ones. And just as Tor mentioned, the expectation is that the default is that you're looking at both sexes unless there's a scientific reason not to do so, and you need to make that case in the application, and reviewers will be asked to comment on the scientific validity of any kind of choice to focus only on one sex versus the other. And then just the last thing I'll say, and I'm going to pass it to my colleague David, is that it's important to also keep in mind that the sex as a biological variable or any of the other biological variables should be factored in, but you don't necessarily have to be powered for those variables unless you are doing research asking questions about those differences. So for example, if you were interested in, what is the effect of music therapy by biological sex, for example, okay, in that sense, you would want to have a statistical analysis plan that goes through demonstrating that you have the power to make conclusions based on sex. If you're trying to just study a question and are including both sexes because it's relevant to both sexes, and again, is it going to be most often what the case is, there it's exactly like Tor mentioned. I just want to reemphasize it. You want to talk about that. You'll be keeping track of sex, but you don't necessarily have to be powered for that, but that you're collecting that data, and that down the road, someone could choose to look at that further, or you might choose to do that as well. So just wanted to add that. And David, please feel free to add. Thank you.
Hi, Tor, that was a really thorough and very well presented primer for writing for writing the approach section. I would just add, I just want to emphasize first what Tom said earlier, repetition, particularly for if it's a clinical trial and you need to meet certain clinical trial criteria. Very important sometimes not to just bury that somewhere, but to repeat it multiple times to give reviewers a chance to see it. The other thing I would talk about is that very often studies use multiple comparisons. And when they have lots and lots of DVs, and sometimes they don't address clearly how that's going to impact the statistical analysis. You don't want to give reviewers the opinion, the impression that you're throwing a bunch of things against the wall and hoping that something sticks. So corrections for multiple comparisons. The other thing I would say is that there's probably a split amongst reviewers in terms of whether they are very theoretical driven and model driven and want to see model driven studies versus those who are more open towards, let's say, data discovery trials. So, even if something is not known, it's always good to have to present the model of what you think will happen, even if it's good, even if there hasn't been prior research and there's many possibilities, it's always good to try to be as model driven as possible. The final thing I would say is figures. Very often people put in figures that are very complex or have multiple panes. If you have to try to put yourself in the reviewer's position who's reading multiple grants. Reviewers can get frustrated if the figure is overly complex, if they can't see things, particularly if the captions are teeny tiny. And so you may have some really nice figures, but what's most important is that it conveys the idea that you're referencing it in the text as clearly as possible. And that's all I have.
Thanks so much, David. And Tor, if I can, I just have, I know another colleague of mine, Luci Roberts, wanted to just add another aspect about this policy. So Luci, please.
Thank you. Ditto everything everybody else has said. I just wanted to clarify that the sex as a biological variable policy applies to both human subjects and vertebrate animal research. So for the record.
Terrific.
Thanks for that. And Laura, just want to see, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Nope.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much, Tor, for the chance to add on to that. And please continue. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. These are fantastic comments, and I'm so glad we're recording this session because these are tremendous insights. And yes, I'm thinking about all the grants I've seen with like kind of illegible figures or text. So David, thank you for calling that out specifically, because that is a kindness to reviewers and a kindness to your chances of getting a good score if you can present materials that are actually readable and don't lead to eye strain. All right, Julene, let's move forward to the next. So there's a new data sharing policy, data sharing plan policy that's coming. And let me just step through these bullets, and then I'll definitely invite my more knowledgeable NIH colleagues to come on the line and share their insights about this forthcoming policy. So effective January 25th of next year, 2023, NIH will be requiring investigators who are applying for NIH funding to submit a 2-page detailed data sharing plan. Now, this plan is separate from the research strategy document, so it's just to let you know, it should not count against the research strategy page limit, so that's good news. The outline of the plan should include the data type, related tools, software and code, standards, data preservation, access, and associated timelines, access, distribution, and reuse considerations, and oversight of data management and sharing. So these terms actually have specific definitions. And so I have a pointer in here to sharing.nih.gov, which is a hub website for all things data sharing related. And that website, the particular hyperlink I have here, links to definitions for each of those categories. Now, one thing that I find in working with early stage investigators, and this is actually one way I learn well too, is that it's really helpful sometimes to see examples of those who have come before you in terms of how they've worked with these different categories. And so I'd just like to make a shout out to NIMH, which has a nice data management and sharing plans paragraph on this hyperlinked page down here at the bottom that lists some examples from NIMH funded studies. And I will be frank, I and my colleagues here at UCSF are still getting up to speed on this new requirement and are working with folks in our library who lead our data sharing initiatives, and they've been hooking up UCSF with various data sharing repositories and archives to enable researchers at UCSF, for instance, to have a number of different places that would be suitable for their data to deposit it when the time comes. So Tom, I see you're coming on the line. So would you like to tell us more about this new requirement?
Thanks so much, Tor. And just know that you're not alone about kind of working to get up to speed on this. So this is the policy was announced a couple years ago, but we're getting close to the implementation date now. So big thing I want to just really emphasize is that first link, the sharing.nih.gov, is, in my humble opinion, one of the best websites NIH has ever put together for extramural resources. And I think does a fantastic job of walking you through of how does this policy apply to you, gives you, just like Tor outlined, the elements of this new plan. There's even a template that's provided of what you could use to generate this plan. It kind of has these like 5 different topic areas. And I think that's one of the best ways to kind of get started, but just know that this is brand new. NIH is even still continuing to kind of work on some of this implementation details. So I think if you keep that website link handy, that will help you stay up to date on these things. But just give it a thorough read as much as you can. And then just know that the big change here is that the expectation is that you will share the data used to generate the conclusions that you have reached, regardless of whether it's been published or not, by the time of publication or the end of the project period, whichever kind of comes first. So that's the big change here. And yeah, just utilize that website. And I think I'll stop there. David, please add anything if you'd like.
Oh, I just wanted to say that NIMH has its own data sharing policies that would if you're applying to NIMH, many grants already require data sharing. So for those who are going to apply before January 2023, which I know is right around the corner, you should check with your program manager. And even if it's not technically required, it's always strongly encouraged.
David, that is such a good point. And so let's just add a little bit more that one thing that can sometimes make this a little bit more complicated is that there's about 24 different institutes and centers at the NIH that award extramural grants. And there are cases where they might have different policies, some more stringent than the overall NIH one. So I think, again, one really nice thing about this new sharing.nih.gov website is it gives you a place to start. And there's also information about if you have a good sense of which institute or center your application might be going to, and this is based on the topic that you're doing, that can help you. That website can help steer you to whether there's any additional policy considerations that you need to be taken into account. If you don't know which institute or center your application might be going to, this is kind of where like speaking with a program officer can be helpful. If you don't know who that might be, one of the best things that you can do is just Google NIH Matchmaker. This is a tool as part of our NIH reporter that lists all grants that the NIH has funded. In there, you can input like a scientific abstract or specific aims and click this button that says find similar program officials. That will kick out a list of program officers, which is like the job that I hold. And you can kind of just look at that first name listed there and reach out to that person and just try to give an initial sense of, hey, this is something I'm working on. I used Matchmaker, found your name. Do you think this application would be a good fit for your institute? And that's where you can kind of get started on that. You could even ask, are there any additional data sharing considerations that I should be aware of if you weren't able to find it on that sharing website? So lots to kind of keep track of here. But again, I think that sharing website's a good place to start. And then you have these additional resources that I just mentioned as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I mean, what little I know so far about the data sharing plan requirement has come from webinars that were put forward by the sharing.nih.gov group. So and clicking around, going through the website and looking at the content there. So I wholeheartedly +1 on your recommendation for everyone to go check out that site. All right, Julene, let's move to the next slide. So after all that, we're still not done with the approach. There are often 2 additional paragraphs that are included at the end of the approach. One of them, and it's often placed in the penultimate position, so the next to last, is anticipated concerns and alternative strategies. So this would be a spot where you'd list potential problems that you think could be that could come up when you implement the study and how you might overcome them. And in my experience, at least with the grants that I've seen and been a part of, the section often focuses on issues involving difficulties recruiting participants more so than other issues, say such as data analysis challenges. Although if you're doing a secondary analysis focused project, then maybe you would talk maybe about some of the challenges inherent in extracting data, managing it, going through it, cleaning it, etc. And basically what reviewers are looking for here is to see if you've anticipated potential stumbling blocks that might be a threat to your ability to complete the specific aims that you've proposed. And what are your thoughts about potential alternative strategies that you can invoke so that you don't get so that your study basically doesn't get threatened with being able to be completed. And then the final paragraph, and it's really good if you can to preserve some space for this, is to end on a summary of anticipated contributions. And this paragraph is really an opportunity for you to summarize what you'll anticipate will be the high health impact and contributions of the findings that you'll get from the study you're proposing. And if it's written compellingly, it'll leave the reviewers with thinking about your application on a really high note. And that's how you want to leave them, rather than say have the application end with like a really kind of detail-y, in the weeds paragraph. Like I've seen some applications that end with something like a sample size paragraph or something like that. And it's kind of, it leaves the reviewer with a little bit of a ho-hum feeling, like, okay, you maybe covered all the bases, but in the end, like, what's the big picture, so what aspect of this work that's really going to help move the needle to improve health in a given population. All right, Julene, let's move to the next. So one thing that I found when I was doing a little bit of research for this presentation is potential problem areas or pain points that can occur in NIH applications. And one list that I found that I think is really nice from this year, from earlier in the year at the Nexus NIH website, is the list that's presented here, and I've bold-faced some that I think could be particularly salient. And just going through the list quickly, one issue is lack of new or original ideas. Another is absence of an acceptable scientific rationale. So I think Julene and Sheri did a fantastic job of giving us all tips that can help us avoid falling into the traps of those first 2 bullets. Lack of experience in the essential methodology that you're proposing to use. That one would seem like a no-brainer, but I think oftentimes people may have the experience and they may have it in their head, but translating it into a clear way that a busy reviewer who's reading the 80 applications on the plane on the way to Washington will pick up on, that can sometimes trip applicants up. questionable reasoning in the experimental approach. So as was stated earlier, you definitely don't want to give reviewers the sense that maybe you're trying to, as was phrased earlier, kind of throw things against the wall. You want to have a real logic to why you chose a particular study design and what you're likely to learn from it. An uncritical approach. So as Sheri was noting earlier, you, as part of the rigor assessment, you're going to want to view the previous research literature with an eye towards rigor and looking for strengths, but also shortcomings that could be fulfilled by the study you're proposing. Diffuse, superficial, or unfocused research plan. So again, just kind of harping on this theme that reviewers are reading a lot of text and a lot of applications, and it's really incumbent upon you to help them to understand what it is that you're trying to do and not put them in a position of having to try and guess or work extremely hard to try to figure out what it is that you're trying to get at. Lack of sufficient experimental detail. This one's kind of tricky because if you give too much detail, reviewers can get overwhelmed and bogged down. But if you don't supply enough detail, then reviewers don't have the requisite information they really need to judge whether they, in their opinion, the study will be successful and rigorous. Lack of knowledge of published relevant work, that's another one. An unrealistically large amount of work proposed. So this is something that in our summer training program, we see a lot with new scholars coming in. They propose like 20 years worth of, like a whole career of research in one grant application. So it's really a good idea to run your work, your proposed ideas by trusted colleagues to get their objective reactions as to whether the scope is really in line with the particular grant mechanism that you're targeting. And then uncertainty concerning future directions. So this gets at what I was saying on the previous slide about having a kind of wrap it all up paragraph at the end about what the impact of this can be. And some applicants choose to allude to future directions as part of that ending paragraph. I've also seen this at the bottom of the specific aims page sometimes. So let's move to the next slide if we can. And I'd like to just discuss some issues that NIMH has targeted as having come up with approach sections in particular. So one is, and I alluded to this on the previous slide, too much unnecessary experimental details. So you need the necessary details, but not a lot of not a lot of detail, especially detail that's not relevant to the study at hand. You might also not include enough detail on approach, like we were talking about on the previous slides. And that's true for especially if you're proposing something that's untested. So if you're using something that's not a typical design, for instance, or not a typical measurement tool, you're going to need to justify that more than if you're using or proposing to use something that everyone's already familiar with. So it's when you say, I'm going to do a parallel arms randomized controlled trial, most people know what that is. It has a long established track record, but if you propose some very exotic design, then, something new or like a micro randomized trial, then you logically would need to spend a little bit more time in your application explaining why that design is rigorous and why it's especially appropriate for the particular study that you're proposing, because reviewers will be less familiar with it. And so they need you to help them to understand why you've chosen it. Not enough preliminary data to establish feasibility. This is something we see in R01 applications sometimes. An applicant has a wonderful idea, but there's just not enough preliminary data yet to establish that, say, a particular intervention is necessarily feasible and acceptable to members of the research population. So you have to have that preliminary data for certain applications, as we discussed earlier. Feasibility of each aim not shown. So if you go aim by aim, like we were talking about earlier, it's important that each aim is feasible and that you've made that clear to the reviewers. Little or no expertise with the approach. So if you're a qualitative oriented methodologist and you propose a big quantitative trial, it's really incumbent upon you to leverage your connections and bring on partners who have expertise with the approach, so that the team overall has the expertise that's necessary to carry out the work in a rigorous way. Lack of appropriate controls. This is another one that we see sometimes. The applications may be submitted where the controls are not clearly defined. The control group experience in an RCT is not fully articulated, so reviewers struggle to understand what is the control. And if you're comparing some new intervention to a control and the control is not well defined, then that implies that the intervention effect may not be as clean and rigorous as it would if there was like a really nice, tight, clearly defined control group. Not directly testing hypotheses. That is one that we also talked about, and Tom made the point that you definitely do not want to be perceived as kind of throwing everything against the wall and not testing like specific focused hypotheses. And that's the next item here, correlative or descriptive data. If it's not accompanied by tightly specified hypotheses, reviewers can mark down an application because they may feel it's too unfocused, and also not addressing the multiple comparisons issue that was brought up as well. Inadequate consideration of power. So we see this sometimes where folks have a very limited description of the sample size, calculations, and input. And it's not like I think applicants need to provide formulas or tremendous amounts of detail, but there needs to be enough for reviewers to really understand what the assumptions behind the power analysis were. And some reviewers, in my experience, actually have preferred to have enough detail that they can replicate the power analysis should they wish to do so. Experiments not directed towards mechanisms. So this is one where there should be clearly defined mechanisms, and that's where your conceptual diagrams and conceptual models can really help you elucidate what the mechanisms are likely to be, and then the experiments need to be tied to the conceptual model, and your measures also need to be tied to the conceptual model. No discussion of alternative models or hypotheses. So this is another one where an applicant may submit an application that talks about specific models or hypotheses, but doesn't really include ways to rule out alternative models or hypotheses. And so in the end, when they get their results, that means that their results may not be as rigorous as they could have been, because we won't know if the effects that they see are due to what they're postulating as the cause or some other cause or causes. We just talked about this already. No discussion of potential pitfalls. You definitely want to have that consideration of potential problems and alternatives. And it's not necessarily just limited to that penultimate paragraph in the application that I described a few slides back, although that's certainly a great place to have much of it. But if there are appropriate places in line in the approach where you can show that you have considered things that could potentially threaten your ability to carry out the study and have controls or things in place to procedures in place to address those before they become problematic. I think that's all to the good, because it shows reviewers that you're thinking about the study that you're proposing in a very deep and forward-thinking way. And then lastly, no discussion of interpretation of data. So what does it all mean once you get your results? And again, I think also in preliminary studies, it's important to have a clear, clean, tight interpretation of the data that you're presenting in that section and what it means for the study that you're proposing. Next. So final thoughts. Thanks for bearing with me this long. In my experience, the approach can be one of the hardest sections of the research strategy to write because it differs substantially from one application to another, depending on the scientific requirements of the application. This is really truly where one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And for learners by example, that can make mastering writing an approach section especially challenging. So as always, I recommend starting the drafting process as early as possible. You want to seek intramural review from colleagues and mentors iteratively and often. It's a good idea too to review others' applications because in my experience, that puts your mind in a reviewer mindset. And you want to try, as was suggested earlier, try to anticipate reviewer questions and get ahead of them in the application. Next slide. So here are some additional resources that we have from the NIH, and also there's a pointer down at the bottom to soundhealth.ucsf.edu. And Julene, I don't know if we want to spend time on any of these or just move to the Q&A. Okay, Q&A.
Yes,
and I see Laura has her hand up.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing quickly before we move to Q&A, something that I wanted to echo that Tom brought up earlier, which was, using Matchmaker and contacting a program officer, and something that Tor mentioned, start early. One thing I really want to emphasize is reaching out to us as program officers, whether you find our name through the Matchmaker or on all of the RFAs, the grant, the call for grant applications, you're going to see a program contact on there, which is a program officer. So feel free to shoot, that person an email, and don't feel, you don't need to hold back. This is part of our job. A big part of our job is talking to grantees or potential grantees about your research and where is the best home for your research. Send us a draft of your specific aims and we can set up a call to talk about them. So I really just want to encourage you to reach out to NIH program, and also echo what Tor mentioned about talking to your colleagues, trying to, if you know that a colleague applied for a grant, asking, hey, can I read that and the summary statement that you got? And try to just become familiarize yourself. I know that, the NIH is and applying for NIH grants is kind of it's a huge deal, and it can be very overwhelming when you're not familiar with it. So do, talk to your colleagues, your peers, and reach out to us at the NIH as well, because we want to help.
Thank you. That's terrific. I love how all of you are saying, please contact us, please contact us. That's just so wonderful. Yeah. Other comments?
So I wanted to invite our colleagues on video. We have a few questions from our audience, but wondered first, thank you so much, Tor and Sheri, and thank you for our NIH colleagues and also Sunil with the National Endowment for the Arts. We really appreciate your time and wisdom here. Before we go to the Q&A, does anybody have any final thoughts they want to add? Okay, hearing none. I have the first question. Does Sound Health also include research on musicians' health? Who would like to take that if you want to raise your hand? Research on musicians' health. Tom.
So I can take a stab at it. And the short answer, yes. I think you might need some more information to kind of learn where would be maybe the best home for that kind of application. If it's really kind of focused on things related to, musicians as an occupation kind of thing, and more occupational health, it's possible that OSHA, which is another part of the government that you may be familiar with for kind of worker safety, that kind of thing, they actually support research programs as well. And it's possible something like that might be a better fit for OSHA than NIH, but the blanket recommendation that you've heard before, and I'm just going to say it again, is reach out to a program officer. We might be able to give you more information on where might be the best place to send an application like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Anybody else want to add to that? Good advice. Another question is, who is the best contact person at the Sound Health Network to introduce ourselves to? I can answer that question. So Sheri, Robb, and I are both on the leadership team of the Sound Health Network, and we have two other additional folks who also serve in that role. And I wanted to encourage anybody who wants to get in touch with the Sound Health Network to go to our website, soundhealth.ucsf.edu. We have a place you can click that says contact us, and that gets sent directly to us. And if you have any specific questions about the Sound Health efforts, you're welcome to ask us there. That would be the best place, I think, to reach us. Sheri, did you want to add anything more?
No, I think that's perfect.
And Tom?
Julene, I wonder if I could make another plug for your website, and that's that if anybody's watching this webcast and maybe doesn't have a lot of experience with the NIH system, I think one of the best things that you can do is look for a partner or collaborator. So, people in academic research settings and in business and other parts, they may have more experience with applying for the NIH, NIH grant system. They'll have the appropriate registrations that you'll need for that. It actually takes quite a bit of paperwork to kind of be able to become eligible for one of these programs, even though just about anybody can. But so I think the best advice that we can give you, and this is what I do when people reach out to me saying, I'm interested in this, but don't know how to get started, is I send them to the Sound Health Network's directory, which has a whole long list of people interested in this area, including researchers who may be very familiar with the NIH system, like Julene, like Sheri, like Tor, and potentially use that as a way of kind of finding potential partners that could help you navigate the system if you've got a great idea, but maybe not as much experience with the NIH or federal government system in general. So I just wanted to thank you all for providing that resource, and I think it's tremendous and helps kind of make some of these connections that can be so important for getting started. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, and also we list the NIH and NEA grant or the funding opportunity announcements also on the Sound Health website. And you can also explore some of our prior webinars that are by topic typically. And also we have a newsletter that highlights the work that's being done in music and health and wellness space. So really encourage folks to check those resources out. I had a question. I was wondering if our NIH colleagues could talk a little bit about what is it about this music and health interagency interest in this topic, and how did you all kind of get this going? This is really remarkable because there's so many institutes that are represented on this webinar, and also that are even a larger number that are represented in the task force. So I would love to hear more about the interest from the NIH institutes and centers.
Laura, you want to try to tackle that one?
You can start.
Okay, so I think just briefly, previous director of the NIH, Francis Collins, is really, along with Renée Fleming, is a big part of how this all got started, at least at the NIH, and we're so grateful for partners at the NEA and the Kennedy Center that have also contributed to this so much. And how Dr. Collins tells the story is he and Renée were at a dinner party and just talking about how even in the popular press, I actually keep track of articles that come out in the popular press for the NIH side. And it's just about every week something comes out about, a new finding about how music impacts the brain or health in general or creativity. And just remarking upon, it really seems like these kinds of things are coming more and more. And along with that, the tools that we have to study the brain, for example, have really increased significantly just in the past 10, 15 years or so. Some of you may know of the Brain Initiative as just one example of an effort that the NIH has led, along with others, of just developing tools to better understand the brain. And we've never, in the history of science, we've never had the chance to really understand what's happening in the brain more than what we do now. And it gives us a chance to kind of, dig deep and understand when people are listening to music, whether it's, just for enjoyment or for potentially for, some kind of medical benefit or well-being benefit, we have a better chance of understanding now what is actually going on in the brain. And the more we understand about that, the more we may be able to, enhance those interventions, make them more effective, make them more accessible to other populations that maybe don't have access to them. So, this fits squarely within the NIH's mission, which is really trying to understand biology and what we can do to potentially promote and enhance health. And I think if we given that a lot of the intractable health issues that we're dealing with now in terms of pain, dementia, different types of cancer and chronic illnesses, we are open to any potential interventions that can be studied in a scientifically rigorous way to try to learn more and just enhance, what we can offer people for health and well-being. So a little bit of a rambling response, but that's really kind of how we got started, why this is, something of great interest to the NIH and why we're so excited to be a part of it. And maybe just the last thing I'll say is, NIH has a lot of broad initiatives that happen, but, it's so fascinating and exciting to me that for this one involving music, it's the entire NIH is interested in this, which doesn't always happen very often. And I think it's just because music is so universal. And, at NIH, we are admirers of music. Many of us are musicians ourselves, that it's something that we're all excited and interested in as well. So just excited to be a part of this.
That's great, Tom. I really appreciate that insight. And Sunil, I wondered if you could share a little bit about why the National Endowment for the Arts is interested in music and health.
Thanks, Julene. Yeah, it was great to hear from Tom just now. You can hear the passion flowing through his words. We've had a research department for quite a while now, but in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly kind of escalated in terms of research, trying to identify causal mechanisms to understand not just music, but in fact, various arts and arts related interventions and programs to understand how they affect various types of outcomes, health related, human development related, et cetera. And that's one aspect of research. We also do research on economics and community development. But in the arts and health space, as it were, we certainly were really gratified that NIH and through Dr. Collins initially really was inspired to host a workshop that some of us attended in 2017, January 2017, at NIH in the Kennedy Center. And I saw Dr. Collins and Renée Fleming sit side by side for pretty much the whole thing, where we saw some great scientific presentations from the field. And the NEA had been supporting some of that research, but we've invested more heavily in this. And again, getting to collaborate with NIH this way on this particular funding opportunity, but also learning from each other. I think as agencies, we're a relatively small agency. Our primary mission isn't research, but we do take the research component of what we do seriously. We started supporting a lot of randomized controlled studies, in fact, and quasi-experimental studies about music and health. We also have studied supported qualitative research and mixed method studies about music and health. So it's been great to learn alongside NIH, and yeah, we're thrilled to do this. And I think, again, getting back to this network, and I'm glad, Tom, you alerted people to the website. Our hope in having Julene, Sheri, and others stand up this network is to really create a community of practice and research that can be more nimble and can learn from each other over time, and perhaps have a bigger footprint in the conversations with neuroscientists, with a discourse, I should say, with neuroscientists and with health practitioners.
Thank you, Sunil. I see that we're out of questions, so I wanted to thank everybody once again on the panel, our NIH colleagues, Tom, David, Luci, Laura, and Abhi. And I want to thank also again Sunil for your commitment to this topic, and Tor, who is our invited speaker from UCSF, who is just an expert on research design and analysis. And I see a question by Abhi, please.
Yes. I'm a scientific review officer and we run the review panel for these applications. And what I want to say is, if anyone of you want to participate in this review meeting, please contact specific, there's scientific review contact listed in every form, and contact that person and we will include you, because a lot of time it helps to be there and see how the meeting goes, what reviewers look for. And I also want to emphasize, please write your proposal clearly, because reviewers are not allowed to assume anything. They will evaluate on what it is written. And also, after you finish your application, read section 5 and see your application addresses the review criteria, because reviewers will stay focused on section 5. So even though that is the instruction for reviewers, please look at it so that you know if there's something missing or you need to add. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you again for everybody. Thanks for your final comments, Abhi, and a call for reviewers, which is a really important service that you can do for the NIH. Okay, we're going to conclude this webinar. This will be posted to our website, soundhealth.ucsf.edu, I believe immediately, along with the slides from today's presentation. And thank you again for your participation. It's really wonderful to collaborate with you all. See you around.